Imagine yourself in the high seas in the 17th century. The sound of the Atlantic waves mixes with the muffled screams echoing from the hold of a ship. There, hundreds of African men, women and children are chained, crammed into a damp and dark space, with no air to breathe, without enough food to survive. This is not just a detail of history. This is the cruel portrait of the slave ships, vessels that turned the ocean into a true floating cemetery. Have you ever wondered how millions of Africans were torn from their lands and forced to cross the sea on a journey that many called the passage of death? Over more than 300 years, the slave trade brought to Brazil almost 5 million people kidnapped from the African continent, a journey marked by disease, hunger, violence and death, but also by resistance, faith and hope for freedom. This video is not just a history lesson, it is a journey to the past to understand the present. By watching until the end, you will discover details that rarely appear in schoolbooks. How the slave trade operated, who benefited from this inhuman practice, what happened in the overcrowded holds of the slave ships, and how this experience forged not only suffering, but also the identity and culture of the Brazilian people. And there is something even more important. Understanding this tragedy is essential to comprehend the scars that slavery has left on Brazilian society until today. Structural racism, social inequality, the struggles for recognition and memory did not arise by chance. They are direct consequences of what happened on those ships, in the slave quarters, in the quilombos, and on the streets of colonial cities. Get ready. Throughout this narrative, you will be led to dive into stories of pain, but also of courage and resilience. Because knowing the truth about the passage of death is a fundamental step to honor those who never had a voice, and to give meaning to the freedom we still seek. To understand how the slave ships became symbols of one of the greatest tragedies in humanity, we need to go back a few centuries in time to the era when Europe expanded its dominions across the world. In the 15th century, Portugal and Spain opened the first maritime routes to Africa, driven by the ambition for gold, spices, and soon enough, for human beings. It was at this moment that slavery in Brazil began to take shape, even before Portuguese colonization in the Americas. In Africa, diverse and complex societies prospered in organized kingdoms with developed agriculture, active trade, and deep cultural traditions. There were indeed local practices of servitude and slavery, but they were completely different from the model that the Europeans would impose. Traditional African slavery was not based on race, and the enslaved could, in some cases, achieve freedom or even rise socially. What the Europeans did was to transform this practice into a lucrative and racialized trade in which men and women were treated as mere commodities. The first Portuguese expeditions to the African coast resulted in contact with local leaders, who soon realized the advantages of trading war prisoners and inhabitants of neighboring villages in exchange for weapons, fabrics, and other manufactured products. Thus arose the slave markets in Africa, which would become the starting point for the tragedy of the Atlantic crossing. Entire villages were invaded and destroyed, families were broken apart, and thousands of people were forcibly captured. With the advance of colonization in the Americas, the demand for labor grew explosively. The sugar plantations in northeastern Brazil required workers on a large scale, and the indigenous peoples, initially enslaved, could not withstand the diseases brought from Europe, dying by the thousands. It was then that the Portuguese colonizers intensified the Atlantic slave trade, turning their attention to Africa. The so-called triangular trade was consolidated, linking Europe, Africa, and America in a route of exploitation. From Europe came weapons, fabrics, and beverages. From Africa came kidnapped men, women, and children. And from Brazil and the Caribbean returned gold, tobacco, coffee, and above all, sugar, enriching European coffers. slave merchants began to organize fairs in the main coastal cities of West Africa, such as Luanda, Benguela, and the Gold Coast. There, human beings were evaluated like cattle. Physical strength, teeth, and body endurance were inspected. Children were separated from mothers, men from their families, and women were often abused already in this process. For traffickers, each body represented profit. For Africans, it was the beginning of an unimaginable journey of suffering. It is important to remember that slavery in Brazil did not arise from an isolated event, but from a global system of exploitation. The Portuguese crown authorized and regulated the slave trade, collecting taxes and granting monopolies to certain companies. The fortifications built along the African coast, such as the Castle of Elmina, functioned as human warehouses, where thousands awaited days or weeks until a slave ship arrived to begin the voyage to the other side of the ocean. These places were known as slave houses. In them, horror was already present: overcrowding, lack of hygiene, physical and psychological violence. Many did not even manage to embark, dying before facing the passage of death. But those who survived were branded with hot iron, identified as property of merchants or of the crown itself. They were reduced to numbers, to statistics of an inhuman accounting. The profit was enormous. An enslaved African could be bought cheaply in the African markets and sold for a price up to 10 times higher in Brazil. This abyss in values transformed trafficking into one of the most lucrative businesses of the colonial period. Merchants, local authorities, and even religious figures participated in this system, justifying it with racial and even biblical arguments that sought to legitimize dehumanization. Meanwhile, in African villages and kingdoms, the devastation was immense. With each capture expedition, entire villages were wiped out. Thousands of people fled to more remote regions, but even so, the capture networks advanced. Africa began to suffer a brutal depopulation, whose social and economic effects would reverberate for centuries. This cruel machinery that united European colonizers, African kings and merchants shaped the largest forced displacement of people in history, the transatlantic slave trade. It is estimated that more than 12 million Africans were taken to the Americas, and almost 5 million of them disembarked in Brazil, making it the country that received the most enslaved people in the world. It is at this point that the slave ships come onto the scene as protagonists of a story marked by pain. These vessels were designed to transport goods, but adapted to carry human beings in subhuman conditions. Each departure from an African port represented not only a commercial transaction, but also the destruction of lives, cultures, and entire families. And so, with the trade established, the market structured, and the logic of profit above life consolidated, the stage was set for the darkest chapter of this trajectory, the Atlantic crossing, where the ocean would become a sea of suffering and resistance. If the origin of the slave trade revealed how Europe transformed people into merchandise, the African markets were the stage where this brutal logic was consolidated. In the fairs scattered along the West African coast, human life was reduced to numbers and bargains. Entire villages were destroyed by organized capture expeditions, and the survivors were led in chains to the ports, where the most humiliating phase of their existence began: the public sale. These markets operated in large squares or warehouses near colonial fortresses, such as in Luanda, Benguela, Ouida, and other strategic points on the coast. There, slave traders evaluated men, women, and children as if they were beasts of burden. Dentition, musculature, and physical endurance were examined. Those who showed signs of disease were discarded or sold at a much lower price. For traffickers, each body was an investment. For Africans, it was the definitive loss of identity, of name, of history. The capture took place in different ways. In many cases, rival African kingdoms waged war against each other, and the prisoners were sold to European merchants in exchange for firearms, gunpowder, fabrics, and alcoholic beverages. This practice fed an endless machinery. The more internal wars, the more prisoners appeared, and the more prisoners, the more weapons circulated, strengthening the conflicts. Thus, the triangular trade not only transported people, but also destroyed entire social structures in the name of profit. Inside the ships, the reality was even more terrifying. The enslaved were stacked in layers, tied with iron shackles that injured their skin and caused infections. The space reserved for each person was so small that many could not even sit up. The darkness of the holds was suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, urine, feces, and blood. Diseases spread quickly, and epidemics such as dysentery and smallpox killed thousands before even reaching land. It is estimated that for every 100 Africans who boarded, at least 15 died during the crossing. The journey could last from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the route and the weather. During this time, men, women, and children were given minimal portions of food and water, insufficient to maintain their strength. Many refused to eat, attempting suicide as the only escape from that horror. The traffickers, in turn, forced food down their throats or punished them with whippings. Women were particularly vulnerable, suffering constant abuse from sailors and officers. Rebellions did occur. In some voyages, groups of enslaved Africans managed to break free of their chains, attack the crew, and try to take control of the ship. However, these uprisings were brutally repressed, often with massacres that served as warnings to others. Even so, the resistance never ceased. Songs, prayers, and rituals were carried out in secret as a way of preserving identity and faith in freedom. When death came, the bodies were thrown into the sea. The Atlantic waters became the grave of millions, turning that route into what many call the largest underwater cemetery in the world. Yet even amid this tragedy, the enslaved sought strength in the collective hope of survival. Each heartbeat that resisted was an act of defiance against dehumanization. Upon arriving in Brazil, the enslaved faced new humiliations. Disembarkation took place in ports such as Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and São Luís. There, the Africans were once again subjected to inspections, where buyers chose according to age, physical strength, and health. Families that had managed to stay together during the crossing were definitively separated in the slave markets. Auctions took place in public squares, and the enslaved were displayed as if they were objects, while merchants disputed the highest bids. From there, the Africans were sent to sugar plantations, gold mines, urban construction sites, and domestic service. Life expectancy for an enslaved person in Brazil rarely exceeded 10 years of forced labor. Those who resisted were punished with torture, imprisonment, and in many cases, death. Yet in the midst of all this, spaces of resistance emerged. Quilombos, brotherhoods, and cultural expressions that preserved African traditions and created new forms of identity. Slavery lasted in Brazil for more than 3 centuries, sustained by the greed of colonizers and the silence of those who benefited from the system. Only in the year 1888 was the practice officially abolished, with the signing of the Golden Law. But by then, more than 4,800,000 Africans had already been brought to the country, leaving scars that still persist in Brazilian society. The legacy of this history is not only in numbers, but in lives, stories, and cultures that continue to echo today. Samba, capoeira, religions of African origin, culinary practices, and linguistic expressions are living testimonies of the resistance of a people who, even in chains, never stopped being human. Understanding the slave ships and the Atlantic crossing is not just about revisiting the past. It is about recognizing how the foundations of inequality, racism, and social injustice were built. It is about giving voice to those who were silenced and building a collective memory that values dignity and freedom. Because to honor those who were lost in the passage of death is to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. It is to look at the ocean not only as a grave of pain, but also as a mirror of the courage of those who, even in the darkest night, kept alive the flame of hope. It was not only warriors and strong adults who were taken. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. Women were violated and forced to walk long distances to the trading posts. Tied with ropes or restrained by iron collars, groups of captives were led for kilometers to the slave ports. The journey was so brutal that many did not survive and died before even reaching the coastal fortresses. At the fairs, Europeans used various barter items. Fine fabrics, beads, mirrors, and simple tools were offered in exchange for human beings. But the most coveted items were firearms, which gave immediate military power to local kingdoms and perpetuated the cycle of violence. In this way, each African sold did not only represent individual enslavement, but also the collective weakening of entire societies, which lost their youth, their workforce, and their social cohesion. Inside the coastal fortresses, such as the famous Castle of Elmina, the enslaved were crammed into dark and damp cells, without ventilation and with little food. Many waited weeks or even months for the arrival of a slave ship. During this period, they suffered epidemics, sexual abuse, and torture. Women, in particular, were frequently violated by guards and merchants. The stench, the overcrowding, and the despair turned these places into true antechambers of death. To mark ownership, many Africans were branded with hot iron, receiving the seal of the merchant or the company that had purchased them. In this way, their humanity was officially denied and replaced by an inventory number. This systematic dehumanization was essential to maintain the logic of commerce. By reducing men and women to mere commodities, traffickers morally justified the barbarity that sustained their fortunes. The slave market was also a space of public humiliation. The captives were exposed naked or half-naked, forced to walk and show their strength before buyers. Many were auctioned in groups, separated from family and friends, with no possibility of reunion. The pain of separation was so deep that it left marks transmitted through generations. With the increase in demand in the American colonies, especially in Brazil, these markets multiplied and became vital gears of the transatlantic slave trade. It is estimated that in some periods, tens of thousands of Africans passed through these trading posts every year, supplying a network of exploitation that seemed endless. These spaces were not only places of sale, but true centers of cultural and spiritual destruction. Languages, traditions, and family bonds were shattered at each transaction. Each body embarked on a ship represented not only an individual life, but also the loss of a story, of a community, of an interrupted future. And so, when the slave ships finally docked at African ports, the tragedy deepened. The captives were led in chains into the ships, where they would be stacked in the holds to face the cruelest stage of all. The Atlantic crossing, a journey of weeks or months in inhuman conditions. The sea would become from then on the cemetery of hundreds of thousands of lives. The African markets were the starting point, but it was inside the slave ships that the cruelest face of the slave trade was revealed. For many Africans, the moment of embarkation represented the beginning of a journey that would become known as the passage of death. The Atlantic, immense and merciless, became a corridor of suffering where thousands lost their lives before even reaching Brazil. The vessels used for the transport of Africans had not been designed to carry people, but rather goods. Adapted for this inhuman trade, the ships were divided into narrow and stifling compartments called holds. In them, men, women, and children were piled in rows, lying side by side, chained by wrists and ankles, without space even to move. The air was scarce. the humidity constant, and the darkness almost total. The conditions were so precarious that the mortality rate during the voyage could vary between 15 and 20%, depending on the duration of the route and the weather conditions. This means that out of every 100 people who boarded, at least 15 would never arrive alive at their destination. Many times, the bodies of those who died remained piled up next to the survivors for hours or days until they were thrown into the sea. The voyage lasted on average from 40 to 90 days, but in extreme cases it could extend for up to 4 months. During this time, the captives received minimal food, made of scraps and spoiled rations. Water was rationed, and dehydration killed as many as epidemics did. Dysentery, smallpox, and tropical fevers were frequent and spread quickly in closed environments. The stench of excrement mixed with the smell of blood and sweat, creating an unbearable atmosphere. Beyond hunger and disease, there was the weight of physical and psychological violence. Many Africans were whipped when they tried to resist or refuse to eat. Women suffered constant abuse, turned into objects of the brutality of the crew. Children cried incessantly, often without understanding why they were far from their families. Despite the repression, resistance never ceased to exist. There are records of revolts inside the ships, in which groups of enslaved Africans tried to take control of the vessel. Some of these uprisings were crushed with extreme violence, resulting in massacres that ended with dozens of dead. Others had relative success, forcing traffickers to change routes or to reinforce security even more. The fear of the Europeans was so great that many ships kept armed men constantly watching the holds. Even so, the flame of freedom persisted in the hearts of those who, even in chains, did not accept slavery as destiny. Some chose another form of resistance, suicide. To jump into the sea was, for many, the only way out of the horror. For Africans, who saw the ocean as the dwelling of spirits, diving into the deep waters meant returning to the homeland, even if only in spirit. This spiritual dimension is fundamental to understanding the Atlantic crossing. Many Africans, even in the midst of suffering, sang, prayed, and invoked their deities. This inner strength was what allowed cultural survival, which would later flourish in Brazil in the form of music, religion, and resistance. The pain of the voyage could not silence the memory of the peoples torn from their villages. The crews of the ships also suffered, although on a smaller scale. Poor sanitary conditions favored epidemics that struck sailors and captains. Still, for them, it was a calculated risk, rewarded by the high profits obtained with the sale of Africans in Brazil and other parts of the Americas. Accounts from travelers and missionaries of the time describe scenes of horror. An English captain, upon observing a Portuguese ship, wrote that the holds resembled a miniature hell, with screams, groans, and the unbearable stench of death. These descriptions circulated throughout Europe and fueled moral debates about slavery, although they did little to stop the system for centuries. For many Africans, the ocean became the final cemetery. It is estimated that about 2 million people died during the Atlantic crossing, thrown into the sea without any ceremony. The Atlantic thus became the largest unmarked cemetery in human history. Each wave carries the memory of interrupted lives, untold stories, and mutilated cultures. However, the passage of death was not only a space of destruction, but also of resistance and survival. Cultural memory, the songs sung in the holds, the rituals of faith, and even the plans of revolt kept the flame of humanity alive in the midst of terror. This spirit of resistance would be carried to Brazil, transforming into quilombos, African-based religions, and traditions that survive to this day. When the ships finally docked at Brazilian ports, the feeling was not relief, but continuity of the tragedy. Disembarkation represented the beginning of a new phase of suffering, marked by slave auctions, the separation of families, and the forced adaptation to a ruthless system of exploitation. Thus, the Atlantic crossing must be remembered not only as the physical displacement of millions of people, but as a deep wound that shaped both Africa and Brazil. Every kilometer traveled in the ocean meant distance from freedom and the approach of a destiny of pain, but also the seed of a resistance that would never be extinguished. And it is precisely at the moment when the ships touched the Brazilian coast that a new stage of this story began. The ports of Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, and Recife would become the great points of arrival, where the tragedy of the ocean turned into open commerce and new forms of suffering. It is about this arrival that we will speak next. When the slave ships finally reached the Brazilian coast, the silence of the ocean was replaced by the murmur of the ports. Salvador, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro became the main disembarkation points, receiving thousands of Africans each year. For the survivors of the Atlantic crossing, disembarkation did not mean freedom or relief, but the beginning of a new stage of pain. The solid ground seemed to promise safety, but soon revealed itself only as the stage for yet another humiliation, the slave auctions. As soon as they came down from the ships, the Africans were taken to warehouses or public squares, where they went through a kind of improvised quarantine. Those who were sick were discarded or sold at low prices, while the younger and stronger were evaluated with special attention. Men were forced to display their muscles, women were examined as potential reproducers, and children were auctioned as future sources of labor. For the merchants, each body represented profit. For the Africans, it meant the definitive loss of any hope of reunion with their families. The accounts of the time describe scenes of profound emotional violence. Mothers begged not to be separated from their children, siblings were sold to different masters, and couples were torn apart before the crowd. The logic of commerce was cold. The more families were fragmented, the easier it would be to control individuals. The slave system fed on loneliness and dehumanization. The squares where the auctions took place became symbols of slavery. In Salvador, for example, the Pelourinho Square was not only a place of sale, but also of punishment. The pillories rose in the center as instruments of fear, wooden posts where the enslaved were whipped in public to serve as an example. The same square where people were traded was also where punishment was displayed. This combination of commerce and violence reinforced the idea that Africans were not people, but property. After the purchase, the new owners led the enslaved to their rural or urban properties. Many were forced to walk long distances to sugar mills, coffee plantations, or gold mines. Others remained in the cities, employed as porters, cooks, or domestic workers. In any of the destinations, life was marked by exploitation and daily violence. The slave trade had become such a lucrative business that it drove the colonial economy. Governors, merchants, and even religious figures participated directly or indirectly in this trade. The Portuguese crown charged taxes on each African disembarked, enriching itself at the cost of human suffering. It is estimated that almost 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil over more than 300 years, making the country the largest receiver of enslaved people in the entire American continent. But the arrival in Brazil also brought seeds of resistance. Even amid violence, Africans preserved traditions, songs, dances, and religions. Songs sung during work, prayers whispered in the slave quarters, and rituals practiced in secret were ways of keeping alive the memory of their origins. This cultural legacy, born of pain, is still today an essential part of Brazilian identity. For the sugar mill lords and landowners, the auctions represented the guarantee of abundant and cheap labor. For the Africans, they were the confirmation that the ocean had not been the end of suffering, but only the first stage. Now, chained to new lands and subjected to masters who spoke a strange language, they would have to face the daily weight of exploitation in the slave quarters. Disembarkation, therefore, was a perverse rite of passage. The sea crossing, marked by fear and death, was transformed into submission before the public square. Each sail was the materialization of the system that sustained the wealth of the colony. But, at the same time, each tear and each song kept in silence was also the seed of resistance that would later explode in revolts, escapes, and the formation of quilombos. Thus, upon stepping onto Brazil, the enslaved African not only entered a new territory, but a machinery of exploitation that would shape Brazilian society for centuries. The history of slavery does not end in the ports or in the auction squares. It deepens in the cold nights of the slave quarters, in the long days of forced labor, and in the punishments that sought to destroy hope. And it is precisely this daily reality, made of sweat, blood, and resistance, that marks the next chapter of our narrative. Life in the slave quarters, where the body was exploited, but the spirit continued to resist. If the slave ports and the auctions were the stage of arrival, the slave quarters became the daily destination of those who survived. They were simple constructions made of beaten clay, wood, or stone, with thatched roofs or rough tiles. There, dozens of men, women, and children were crammed into damp and dark spaces, with insufficient windows and poor ventilation. Bodies lay side by side on straw mats, in precarious hygienic conditions, exposed to diseases and pests. Life in the slave quarters was marked by deprivation. The diet, based on manioc flour, beans, and meat scraps, barely sustained the exhausting hours of labor. The enslaved awoke at dawn, before the sun rose, and only finished their tasks when darkness already covered the mill or plantation. Forced labor made no distinction between age or gender. Men cut cane, carried logs, mined. Women planted, harvested, cooked, and often faced the same heavy work as men. On the large sugar plantations, the workday was brutal. Cutting cane required constant strength under the scorching sun. In the mills, work at the presses and boilers was dangerous. Accidents were frequent, and few had access to medical care. In the gold and diamond mines, the enslaved spent hours submerged in water, sifting sediments, exposed to diseases and physical exhaustion. Beyond exploitation, there was the weight of enslaver punishments. The pillory stood in the squares as a symbol of violence. Whippings, stocks, iron collars, and iron masks were used to punish any attempt at resistance. Fear was the main instrument of control, but it was also fuel for hatred and the desire for freedom. Many endured the pain in silence while planning escapes, revolts, or other forms of resistance. Enslaved women faced double violence. In addition to heavy labor on plantations and in the masters' houses, they were constantly victims of sexual abuse by masters and overseers. From these forced relations, children were born who, in many cases, were sold while still young or exploited from an early age. Mothers fought to protect their children, but rarely had any power over their destiny. This pain, transmitted from generation to generation, marked deeply the history of slavery in Brazil. Even amid oppression, life in the slave quarters was not only suffering, it was also a space of cultural resistance. At night, after work, Africans from different regions shared songs, chants, dances, and rituals. The memory of Africa was preserved in the rhythms of drums, in improvised percussion, and in whispered prayers. Faith in African deities, often hidden under Catholic symbols, helped keep identity alive. From this environment were born cultural expressions that today are part of the soul of Brazil, such as capoeira, candomblé, and samba. The slave quarters, therefore, were not only places of submission, but also of hope. Collectivity strengthened bonds of solidarity. By sharing pain, dreams, and strategies, the enslaved found ways to endure the harshness of daily life. This spirit of unity would be essential for the creation of quilombos, refugees of freedom that arose in different parts of the territory. Nevertheless, The weight of slavery was devastating. The life expectancy of an enslaved African in Brazil was short. Many did not survive more than 10 or 15 years of forced labor. The logic of the system was not concerned with preserving lives, but with continuously replacing them with new captives brought from Africa. The colonial economic machine was structured to drain the last drop of energy from each body. For the masters, the slave quarters were a warehouse of labor force. For the Africans, they were a space of pain, but also of silent resistance. Each song, each prayer, each gesture of solidarity represented a refusal to accept total dehumanization. This flame of humanity remained lit, even in the face of the whip, hunger, and oppression. And it is precisely from this resistance that the next chapter of our narrative is born. From the nightly drumbeats and dreams of freedom arose the quilombos, symbols of the fight against slavery and of the hope to build a free life in lands marked by violence. Amid the brutality of forced labor and the constant surveillance of masters, enslaved Africans never ceased to resist. African resistance was not limited to great revolts or escapes to form quilombos. It was present in daily life, in each gesture, in each song, in each symbol preserved in the shadows of the slave quarters. Slavery tried to reduce human beings to commodities, but it could not erase their memory, their faith, and their identity. One of the greatest examples of this struggle were the quilombos, these refugees of freedom spread throughout the colonial territory, formed by Africans who fled from farms and mills in search of autonomy. The most famous, the Quilombo of Palmares, gathered thousands of people and resisted for almost 1 century, becoming one of the greatest symbols of resistance against the slave system. There, men, women, and children built an organized society with agriculture, military defense, and preservation of African traditions. But resistance did not happen only in successful escapes. Within the farms, many enslaved people rebelled in silent ways. They sabotaged tools, delayed work, feigned illnesses, or refused to follow orders. These small acts, often invisible to official history, were ways of reaffirming that they did not accept the imposed condition. Cultural preservation was another powerful weapon against dehumanization. At night, in the slave quarters, the sounds of drums echoed, and collective dances kept alive the traditions brought from Africa. Even though they were forbidden by the masters, these manifestations continued, often disguised as Catholic religious festivities. From this fusion were born essential elements of Brazilian culture, such as capoeira, which united fight and dance, and African-based religions, such as candomblé and umbanda. Women played a fundamental role in this process. In addition to enduring the same forced labor and sexual abuses, they were guardians of memory, transmitting to children stories, songs, and prayers that kept the African heritage alive. In religious rituals, often hidden within the slave quarters or in forest clearings, it was they who led chants and kept faith in their deities burning. This cultural resistance was not merely symbolic, it gave strength to endure punishments and daily exploitation. Each song sung, each dance performed, and each ritual preserved were declarations that slavery could imprison the body but not destroy the soul. This flame of humanity was passed from generation to generation, reaching the present in cultural expressions that shape Brazilian identity. Beyond the quilombos, there were organized revolts that directly challenged the slave system. The Malay Revolt, which took place in Salvador in the year 1835, is one of the most remarkable examples. Led by Muslim Africans, it showed the level of organization and courage of the enslaved, even in the face of brutal repression. Although defeated, the Malay left as a legacy the certainty that the fight for freedom never ceased. The fear of the masters was constant. No matter how many punishments they imposed, how strict the laws they created, or how high the pillories stood as symbols of punishment, They knew that the flame of resistance burned in the slave quarters. Night escapes, hidden drumbeats, and even whispers of hope were signs that slavery never managed to completely suffocate the spirit of the Africans. This heritage of resistance and culture is visible even today. Samba, maracatu, capoeira, Afro-Brazilian religions, and so many other expressions born of pain became symbols of national identity. Each song, each drumbeat, each capoeira circle is a testimony that slavery did not win. Thus, when we look at the history of slavery in Brazil, we do not see only pain and violence, but also courage, faith, and creativity. Resistance was the guiding thread that kept African roots alive, even in the midst of the greatest system of human exploitation in history. And it is precisely this resistance that paves the way for the next chapter of our narrative. The long process that led to the end of slavery, marked by revolts, social pressures, and laws that little by little opened the path to the long-awaited freedom. The slave system seemed unbreakable, sustained by centuries of exploitation, by the colonial economy, and by violent control over Africans and their descendants. However, little by little, cracks began to appear. The path to abolition was long, painful, and full of contradictions. It was not a gift from the elite, but the result of internal and external pressures, of revolts, and of tireless struggles for freedom. The first voices against slavery began to echo already in the 18th century. Enlightenment movements in Europe questioned the morality of the slave trade and denounced the barbarity of the slave ships. However, the ideas took time to turn into concrete actions, since the profits obtained from exploitation were enormous. Still, the debate had begun. In Brazil, the resistance of the enslaved never ceased. Quilombos multiplied, urban revolts emerged, and individual escapes became frequent. Each act of rebellion weakened the structure of the system, showing that control was not absolute. Among the most remarkable revolts, the Malay uprising stands out again in the year 1835 in Salvador, led by Muslim Africans. Although violently repressed, this revolt deeply frightened the slaveholding elite and exposed the fragility of the regime. Meanwhile, international pressures grew. England, which had become an industrial power, began to combat the Atlantic slave trade. In the year 1807, it abolished the slave trade in its domains and, in the following years, pressured other countries to follow the same path. British ships patrolled the Atlantic, intercepting suspicious vessels and freeing Africans before they reached their destination. This international pressure was decisive for Brazil to begin limiting the trade. The first major measure came with the Eusebio de Queiroz law in the year 1850, which officially prohibited the transatlantic trade. Although it did not immediately end the practice, it marked a turning point. The arrival of new Africans in Brazil began to decrease, but that did not mean freedom for those already there. On the contrary, masters intensified the exploitation of those who remained enslaved. Other laws appeared in a gradual process intended to delay the end of the system as much as possible. In the year 1871, the law of free birth declared free the children of enslaved women born from that date forward. In practice, many children continued subjected to forced labor until adulthood, but the law represented the first blow to the hereditary logic of slavery. In the year 1885, the law of the sexagenarians granted freedom to the enslaved over 60 years old. However, few reached that age after decades of exhausting labor. These partial measures revealed the resistance of the slaveholding elite in giving up their privileges. Each new law was the result of intense disputes, popular protests, and international pressure. At the same time, the abolitionist movement grew in the cities, led by journalists, lawyers, students, and even members of the elite itself who began to defend the cause of freedom. Abolitionist clubs organized escapes, awareness campaigns, and political actions. The decade of 1880 was marked by an escalation of tensions. Mass escapes, strikes by the enslaved, and urban revolts multiplied. In many regions, slavery was no longer sustainable, and masters were forced to negotiate with free workers. The regime was collapsing from within. Finally, on May 13th of 1888, the Golden Law was signed by Princess Isabel. With only 2 articles, it declared slavery extinct in Brazil. The country became the last in the Americas to officially abolish the slave system after more than 3 centuries of exploitation and suffering. But it is important to understand that abolition did not mean reparations. Millions of Africans and their descendants were freed without receiving land, compensation, or conditions for social integration. While slave owners were compensated in other countries, in Brazil, it was the freed people who had to face alone the harsh reality of racism, poverty, and marginalization. Even so, the signing of the Golden Law was celebrated as a victory. In the streets, popular festivals filled cities and villages. The cry for freedom, so often silenced, finally echoed in the public squares. It was the end of an era, but also the beginning of an even greater struggle to survive in a society that carried, and still carries, the deep scars of slavery in Brazil. And it is precisely about these scars, about the weight of the past in the present, that we will reflect in the next chapter: the legacy of slavery in Brazilian society. The signing of the Golden Law in 1888 officially put an end to the slave system in Brazil, but it did not erase the effects of more than 3 centuries of exploitation. The legacy of slavery remains alive, shaping the social, economic, and cultural structures of the country. To understand Brazil today, it is impossible to ignore the deep marks left by the millions of Africans who crossed the ocean in slave ships and were forced to live and die in conditions of oppression. The first impact was social inequality. Upon being freed, the formerly enslaved received no land, no compensation, and no support from the state. Many remained in the same mills and farms, now working for miserable wages or even just for shelter and food. Others migrated to the cities, forming peripheral communities, often in precarious conditions. Social exclusion was the immediate inheritance of abolition without reparations. This exclusion generated a cycle of poverty that continues to this day. The lack of access to land, to education, and to formal job opportunities prevented the descendants of Africans from achieving equal conditions. Meanwhile, the elite that had grown rich from the slave trade and forced labor maintained privileges and political power. The result was the formation of a profoundly unequal society, where the weight of slavery is still felt. Another evident legacy is structural racism. Since the colonial period, the idea of racial inferiority was used as a justification for exploitation. This logic did not disappear with abolition. On the contrary, it was incorporated into social practices, laws, and institutions. Prejudice, discrimination, and violence against black people are reflections of centuries of systematic dehumanization. But at the same time, resistance left equally powerful marks. Afro-Brazilian culture flourished even in the midst of oppression. Samba, maracatu, capoeira, candomblé, and so many other expressions were born as ways to preserve memory and affirm identity. Today, these manifestations are recognized as cultural heritage, but for a long time, they were persecuted and criminalized, precisely because they represented the strength of a heritage that refused to die. The legacy of slavery is also present in the configuration of cities. Many black communities formed in peripheral areas, far from urban centers, creating the first urban quilombos. To this day, descendants of the enslaved, live in territories recognized as quilombola lands, symbols of the struggle for land and for cultural preservation. These communities are living testimonies of the continuity of resistance. The memory of slavery is another fundamental point. For decades, official history tried to minimize or silence the suffering of enslaved Africans. Monuments exalted colonizers, while the cries of those who died in the holds of the ships were forgotten. Only recently has Brazil begun to recognize the importance of preserving this memory, whether in museums, in cultural spaces, or in the appreciation of Afro-Brazilian traditions. It is impossible to talk about the legacy of slavery without mentioning the fight against racism. Black movements throughout the 20th century denounced the false idea of racial democracy and exposed the inequalities inherited from the slave period. Today, affirmative action policies, such as racial quotas, seek to repair part of this historical injustice, even though the challenges are enormous. The most impressive thing is to realize that, even after centuries of oppression, the descendants of enslaved Africans transformed pain into strength. The African presence in Brazil is visible in music, cuisine, language, religiosity, and in the very way of being of the Brazilian people. What was born as an attempt to erase identities resulted in the creation of one of the richest and most diverse cultures in the world. Therefore, the legacy of slavery in Brazil is twofold. On one side, exclusion, inequality, and structural racism that still persist. On the other, the resistance, culture, and strength of a people who, even in chains, never stopped fighting for freedom. Knowing this heritage is essential not only to understand history, but also to build a more just future. And it is with this reflection that we approach the conclusion of our narrative. After revisiting the horror of the slave ships, the suffering in the slave quarters, and the fight for freedom, it is time to understand how this memory can inspire us to combat the injustices of the present and honor those who never had a voice. The story we have followed so far has shown us the path of pain, resistance, and legacy that slavery left in Brazil. From the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic, crowded with bodies and shattered dreams, to the dark nights in the slave quarters, passing through revolts, quilombos, and the laws that little by little opened space for freedom, each chapter of this narrative is a reminder that millions of lives were sacrificed to sustain the wealth of a few. But slavery was not only a machine of destruction, it also revealed the strength of a people who refused to be erased. Each drum played in secret, each song sung under the whip, each escape to form free communities was an act of resistance that crossed the centuries and reached us. This heritage manifests today in culture, in faith, in music, and in the very way of being Brazilian. However, the official end of slavery in 1888 did not mean the end of its consequences. Structural racism, social exclusion, and inequality are still open wounds, reminding us that abolition without reparations left deep scars. To ignore this legacy is to perpetuate injustice. To recognize it is to give voice to those who never had the chance to tell their own story. And that is why this video exists, to remember that the passage of death was not just a distant episode, but a mark that continues to influence the present. To honor the memory of those who suffered is also to fight against today's injustices, combating prejudice, indifference, and inequality. If this narrative touched you, do not let it be lost in silence. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave your comment. Each gesture of yours helps keep alive the memory of millions of men and women who were torn from their land but never stopped fighting. Because to remember is to resist, and to resist is to ensure that freedom finally is complete.